She said it loud enough for everyone to hear her voice, smooth as silk but sharp as a knife. Of course she won't say anything. She never does. Laughter rippled through the room, quiet and cruel. The clink of glasses, the muted music, the hush of whispered conversations. Everything paused for a moment to let those words sink in. I didn't flinch. My eyes met hers across the table, steady and calm, though my hands beneath the linen cloth were clenched so tight my knuckles burned. The air felt heavy, like it had been sucked from the room, and I could see the flicker of smug satisfaction in her smile. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The room around us was all warm light and soft shadows, like a painting of a perfect evening. The smell of roasted lamb and sweet wine floated in the air, but beneath it was something colder. Something that said this wasn't just a dinner. It was a performance, and she was playing her part perfectly. My brother shifted uncomfortably beside me, his eyes darting from her to me and back again. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it just as quickly. He wouldn't risk it, wouldn't risk her turning that venom on him. I kept my gaze on her, my silence as deliberate as her insult, because she thought my silence meant she'd won. She didn't know it was my weapon. The truth was, I'd learned long ago that words can be twisted, turned into weapons used against you. But silence was power. It was armor. And tonight, I wore it like a second skin. I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of 100 eyes, some pitying, some curious, some just waiting for the next blow to fall. She leaned back in her chair, her wine glass catching the light like a crown, and gave me a smile as sweet as poison. "Well," she said lightly, "some people just aren't meant to speak up, I suppose." The conversation resumed around us, forced and brittle. Forks scraped plates, wine was poured, but the air was still electric, like everyone was waiting for me to break. I didn't. Instead, I reached for my water glass, the cool ceramic grounding me. I took a sip, feeling the cold wash away the taste of her words. My silence stretched out between us like a challenge. Let her think she'd won this round. Let her think my quiet was surrender. Because I'd learned there was power in stillness. Power in refusing to be drawn into her petty games. And while she laughed and preened, I was already planning my next move. The dinner dragged on, each course another opportunity for her to throw barbed words my way. But I didn't rise to the bait. I let her talk. Let her fill the air with her voice, weaving her web of control. And with every word she spoke, I grew stronger in my silence. When dessert was served, I excused myself from the table. My brother watched me go, his eyes apologetic, but he didn't follow. He never did. I slipped out onto the balcony, the cool night air, a relief after the stifling warmth of the dining room. The city stretched out before me, lights twinkling in the darkness, alive and indifferent. I leaned against the railing, my breath fogging in the cold, and let the silence wrap around me like a cloak. Inside, I could still hear her voice, soft and sweet, the edge hidden beneath the sugar. She thought she was safe in that room, surrounded by people too polite to see the truth. She thought my silence meant I was weak, that I had nothing to say. She didn't know that every word I didn't speak was a seed. And I'd been planting them carefully, patiently, waiting for the moment when they would bloom. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. The nights spent in the dark, counting the cracks in the ceiling, the mornings I woke with the taste of her words still bitter on my tongue. I'd swallowed it all, let it settle deep in my bones, let it harden into something stronger than anger. I'd learned to listen in the quiet, learned to see the truths people tried to hide behind polite smiles and and in the stillness, I found my strength. She thought I'd never speak. She was wrong. I stayed on the balcony until the chill had sunk deep into my bones, the cold burning through the numbness like a promise. When I went back inside, the dinner was winding down. The room was loud with forced laughter and clinking glasses, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that the night was just waiting for something to happen. She caught my eye as I slipped back into my seat, her smile a thin blade. "Did you find your voice out there?" she asked sweetly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The power shifted in that moment, subtle but sure. She didn't see it, but I felt it in the quiet, in the way the others looked at me curiously. curious now, no longer pitying. In the way she faltered for just a heartbeat, her smile tightening, as she realized I wasn't playing by her rules. I let the silence grow between us, a wall she couldn't climb. And when she turned away, her laughter a little too bright, I knew she was afraid. Not of my words, but of what I was building in the spaces between them. Because silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything you don't say. It's the weight of every truth you keep close, every secret you guard like treasure. And tonight, I was done letting her think it was weakness. Tonight, my silence was my power. The night after that dinner, I lay awake in my small apartment, the faint hum of the city seeping through the cracked window. My room was dark, lit only by the glow of the street lamp outside, shadows dancing across the ceiling like old ghosts. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that smug smile curling around her words. She thought she knew me. She thought she'd seen everything there was to see the quiet girl in the corner, the girl who never raised her voice, the girl who didn't dare to fight back. She didn't know that my silence was never about fear. It was about choosing my battles, about knowing that some wars are won in the dark. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, listening to the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, the way it echoed in the quiet. The memories came unbidden, and sharp years of whispered insults, of being overlooked and dismissed, of watching her take up all the space in the room while I faded into the background. But even as those memories twisted in my chest, I felt something different underneath. A slow, steady burn. A certainty that I was done letting her write my story for me. The next morning, I rose early, the winter light pale and cold. I brewed coffee and stood at the window, watching the city wake up. People rushed past on the sidewalk, bundled against the cold, their faces turned inward. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something. I couldn't quite name my breath, fogging the glass, as I whispered to myself, "You're not invisible. Not anymore." At work, I kept my head down, but my mind was turning. She worked in the same office building a few floors above me, and I knew our paths would cross again. She was everywhere, her laughter echoing in the halls, her perfume lingering in the elevator. But instead of shrinking away, I started to watch her the way she'd always watched me. She moved like she owned every room, her smile bright and her words sharp. But in the spaces between the laughter, I saw the cracks. The way her smile faltered when she thought no one was looking. The way her fingers drummed restlessly on the table when the conversation didn't bend her way. The way her eyes darted to mine, just for a second, and then away. She was powerful, yes, but she was also afraid. Afraid of the silence she couldn't control. I began to see the patterns, the way she leaned on charm when she felt threatened, the way she turned the smallest slight into a weapon. And in those observations, I found my strength. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to fight the way she wanted me to. I just needed to see her clearly. And wait. One afternoon, I caught her watching me in the break room. She stood with her coffee, her eyes flicking over me like I was something to be weighed and measured. I met her gaze calm and steady and held it longer than I ever had before. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Something like uncertainty. Then she turned away, her shoulders stiff. I smiled into my coffee cup, a quiet triumph that tasted sweeter than any victory she'd ever claimed. At home that night, I sat with my notebook open, the pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. Notes and observations, patterns and plans. I wasn't plotting revenge. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. About taking back the space she'd stolen, about finding the strength I'd always had, and letting it grow. The quiet became my ally. In the stillness, I could see things she couldn't. I could hear the truths she tried to bury under her laughter. And slowly, I began to understand that my silence wasn't a prison. It was a choice. In the evenings, I walked through the city, the cold air sharp and clean. I'd watch the lights of the office towers shimmer against the dark sky, and I'd let the noise of the world wash over me. In that noise, I found my own heartbeat steady and sure. I wasn't small. I wasn't weak. I was just waiting. One night, as I walked past the old library on my street, I paused. The windows glowed softly, the smell of old books and polished wood seeping out every time someone opened the door. I stepped inside the hush of the place, wrapping around me like a blanket. I found a corner table and let my fingers trace the worn spines of the books stacked high around me. I breathed in the quiet, the weight of stories that had survived for centuries. In that moment, I felt the echo of something powerful, a reminder that some of the strongest voices in the world had never been the loudest. She thought my silence was emptiness, but I knew better. I spent hours in the library, my thoughts growing sharper with every page I turned. By the time I stepped back out into the night, the moon was high and the world was hushed. My breath came in soft clouds of white, each one a promise I was making to myself. I wouldn't let her laughter define me. I wouldn't let her words shape the person I was becoming. She thought I'd never speak, but she didn't understand every moment of quiet was another brick in the foundation I was building. A foundation that would outlast every cruel word, every smug smile. As I walked home, the city seemed to glow with possibility, the lights reflecting in the puddles at my feet. I kept my head high, my steps steady, and I knew deep in my bones that the next time she tried to use my silence against me, she'd find it was no longer a weakness. It was my greatest strength. The days blurred into each other, the routine of work and life wrapping around me like a comforting weight. But beneath that calm rhythm, I felt something shifting, like the slow, steady pressure of water wearing away stone. At the office, she moved through the halls like she always had, confident, smiling, always the center of attention. But I watched her differently now. I saw the little cracks in her perfect veneer, the way her eyes narrowed when someone else got a laugh, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She still tried to draw me out, of course. A pointed comment in a meeting, a question asked, with that bright fake kindness that left no room for me to answer. Each time I let my silence stand between us like a wall she couldn't climb. One afternoon, she cornered me in the break room, her voice as sweet as honey. "You're so quiet," she said, her tone light. "Don't you have anything to say?" I met her gaze calm and steady. "No," I said softly, and turned back to my coffee. The word was small, but it landed like a stone in still water. Her smile tightened just a fraction, and I knew she felt it too, the shift in the air, the power in the quiet. At home, I let the silence grow. I spent my evenings in the small, warm light of my apartment, reading or writing, or just sitting with my thoughts. There was a comfort in it, a space that belonged only to me. In those quiet hours, I could feel the shape of my voice, even if I didn't use it out loud. I started to write more pages filled with neat handwriting and carefully chosen words. Not to be shared, not yet. Just for me. Words that had been trapped inside for so long, words that felt like a balm as they spilled out onto the paper. My story in my own hand, without anyone else's voice trying to drown it out. At the library, I found books that felt like friends, stories of women who had been told to be quiet, who had been told to sit still and smile. I read about their defiance, their strength, the way they turned their silence into a weapon. And I felt something grow in my chest, a fierce, quiet pride. One evening, I walked through the neighborhood after dinner, the city lights painting everything in gold. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and I watched the glow of the windows in the houses I passed, each one a small private world. It reminded me that everyone carries their own silence, their own battles. I wasn't alone, not really. At the office, she started to notice the difference in me. The way I held her gaze a little longer, the way my silence no longer felt like submission. She tried to push harder, her comments sharper, but each time I let them roll off me like water. The more she talked, the more I realized that her power came from the noise she made, the way she filled every space with her voice. But mine came from the spaces in between, the quiet she couldn't touch. One morning, she called me into her office. The door clicked shut behind me, and the air felt heavy with unspoken things. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping on the desk in a slow, steady rhythm. "I've noticed," she said, her voice smooth, "that you've been different lately." I said nothing, just watched her calm and steady. She shifted in her seat, her smile tightening. "I wonder," she continued, "if you're forgetting your place." "My place," I echoed softly. The words tasted like ash on my tongue, but I didn't let that show. Yes, she said, leaning forward, her eyes bright with something sharp. Your place. Don't mistake your silence for strength, dear. Sometimes it's just emptiness. I felt the words settle over me like a shroud, but I didn't flinch. Because I knew the truth she couldn't see, my silence wasn't emptiness. It was choice. It was control. It was every word I hadn't spoken, every truth I hadn't given away. I let the quiet stretch between us until it became a weight she couldn't ignore. Then, I stood my hands steady at my sides. Is there anything else? I asked softly. She blinked just once, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. No, she said finally. That's all. I turned and walked out, my footsteps sure and even. Behind me, the office hummed with the low buzz of phones and voices, but it all felt distant, like I was moving through water. At my desk, I sat for a long moment, my hands folded in my lap. I could still feel the weight of her words, but instead of fear, there was something else, something like resolve. She thought my silence was a cage, something that kept me small, but she didn't see that it was a shield, a space where I could gather my strength, shape my thoughts, and bide my time. Because I was done letting her fill the air with her noise, done letting her decide who I was and what I could be. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the power of words, the way they could cut and heal, the way they could build bridges or walls. I thought about how she had always used them as weapons, and how I had learned to use them as armor. And I thought about the moment when I would finally speak. Not for her, not for anyone else, but for me. Because in the quiet, I had found my voice. And when I chose to use it, it wouldn't be to play her game, it would be to end it. Winter finally began to loosen its grip, and with the first breath of spring, I felt something shift inside me too. The sun rose earlier each morning, spilling pale gold across the city's worn sidewalks, and I woke each day feeling like I was drawing closer to something like the quiet strength I'd been building was ready to break through the surface. At work, she kept up her performance, the sweet smiles, the bright laughter, the casual cruelty tucked inside every compliment. But I could see the cracks now, small fractures in the perfect mask she wore. I saw it in the way her laughter grew a little too sharp, her eyes a little too watchful when I walked into a room. She still tried to bait me, tried to draw me into her games. But I stayed silent, my calm steady as stone. She didn't understand that silence isn't the same thing as absence. It's a choice. It's power. And the longer I held it, the more I could feel the balance of power shifting in the spaces between us. One day, she cornered me in the elevator, her perfume cloying and sweet as she leaned in close. "You're awfully quiet lately," she said softly, her voice like honey laced with venom. "Don't you have anything to say?" I looked at her, my expression calm and unreadable. "I'm just listening," I said, my voice soft but sure. And for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. Because she'd always used words as weapons, sharp and bright, designed to cut. But in the quiet, I was stronger. In the quiet, she couldn't twist my meaning, couldn't use my voice against me. The realization settled in my chest like a warm glow. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing. And she could feel it, even if she didn't understand it yet. At night, I lay in bed and thought about everything I'd been through, every time she'd tried to push me down, every time she'd laughed when I stayed quiet. I thought about the girl I used to be, small and careful, afraid to take up space. And I realized I wasn't that girl anymore. I started to find my voice in small ways, in the way I held her gaze when she tried to tear me down, in the way I carried myself shoulders back, eyes steady, refusing to be cowed by her petty cruelty. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight the way she wanted me to. My silence was a promise I was keeping to myself. I will not let you break me. One afternoon, I stayed late at the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. The halls were quiet, the usual bustle of voices and footsteps replaced by a hush that felt almost sacred. I found her in the break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes distant. She didn't see me at first. For a moment, I watched her, the careful tilt of her head, the way her fingers drummed against the porcelain. She looked smaller in that moment, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the cracks underneath. When she noticed me, she straightened her smile, snapping back into place. Still working, she asked, her tone light. I just nodded, moving past her to fill my own cup. The air between us crackled with unspoken things, the quiet humming like a live wire. She tried again. You know, she said, her voice soft. People might think you're hiding something being so quiet all the time. I turned to face her, my eyes calm, my silence deliberate. Maybe I am, I said finally, and watched her eyes widen just a fraction, because that was the truth she couldn't face. My quiet wasn't emptiness. It was preparation. It was the slow gathering of everything she'd tried to tear down. The next day, she called a meeting. She sat at the head of the table, her voice warm and welcoming, but her eyes sharp. She tried to take control of the room the way she always did, but I watched her closely, my silence steady and unbroken. As she spoke, I saw the weight of to let her fill. When the meeting ended, she lingered behind her smile brittle. You think you're so clever? She said softly, her voice low and dangerous. I met her gaze calmly. I don't need to be clever, I said. I just need to be patient. And with that, I walked away, leaving her in the quiet she couldn't control. That night, I sat at my window and watched the city lights flicker in the darkness. I thought about the girl I used to be, the girl who'd let herself be small because she thought it was safer. And I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who understood that silence can be strength, that stillness can be a kind of defiance. I whispered to the night, to the stars above, to the quiet strength I was learning to trust. You don't get to define me anymore. And in that promise, I found the shape of my voice, clear and steady, waiting for the moment when I would choose to let it rise. Spring settled in for real, bringing warm breezes that swept away the last of the winter chill. Each morning, the sun rose a little higher, and the world felt like it was waking up. But inside me, there was still a calm, quiet steadiness, like a slow river that couldn't be rushed. At work, she kept up her game. Her bright laughter echoed in the hallways, sweet as honey and sharp as broken glass. She still tried to cut me down with her careless remarks, to draw me out with half smiles and half lies. But each time I met her with silence, a silence that was no longer uncertain, but deliberate and measured. One day she caught me alone in the copy room. The machines hummed and whirred around us, and she stepped in close, her perfume cloying in the small space. You're awfully quiet these days, she said softly, her voice like velvet. People might start to wonder what you're hiding. I turned to her, my expression calm, my heartbeat steady. Let them wonder, I said. My voice was soft, but it held a weight she couldn't mistake. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she smiled, but there was something brittle in it, something that cracked at the edges. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the tile, and I let her go, because I knew now that I didn't owe her an explanation. My silence wasn't for her. It was for me. At home, I found comfort in the quiet spaces of my life. I spent my evenings reading, curled up in the corner of my couch, with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I let the words of others remind me that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's found in the spaces between heartbeats. On weekends, I walked through the city, letting the hum of life wash over me. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread drifting from the corner bakery, the soft murmur of conversations in the park. These small, gentle things reminded me that I was part of something bigger, even if I didn't always feel like I belonged. One Sunday, I wandered into a tiny bookstore tucked away on a quiet street. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and the scent of old paper and ink wrapped around me like a hug. I spent hours there, losing myself in the stories of people who had learned to rise in their own ways. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes, watched me with a knowing smile. "You're a quiet one," she said, as I paid for my stack of books. "I am," I said, returning her smile. "But sometimes, quiet is where the strongest things grow." She nodded, like she understood. Maybe she did. At work, things began to shift in subtle ways. People started to notice that my silence wasn't weakness. They began to see it for what it was, a choice. A quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. I saw it in the way my coworkers looked at me differently, a flicker of respect in their eyes. In the way conversations shifted around me, a little softer, a little less quick to judge. My silence was no longer an empty space, it was a presence. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish up a project. The office was nearly empty, the light outside fading to the soft glow of evening. I worked in the quiet, the hum of the computer, and the distant traffic outside the only sounds. It felt peaceful. It felt like mine. She walked by on her way out, pausing in the doorway to watch me. "You're still here," she said, her voice careful. "I have work to finish," I said calmly, not looking up. She lingered as if she wanted to say more, but in the end, she just nodded and walked away. As the door clicked shut behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I closed my laptop and stood stretching my arms above my head, feeling the tension ease out of my shoulders. I walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, the air cool and sweet with the scent of early blooms. I felt the weight of everything I'd carried for so long, the doubts, the quiet pain, the nights spent, wondering if my voice would ever be enough, begin to fall away. Because I realized something in that moment, my silence was never about fear. It was about understanding, about learning to hear my own heartbeat steady and sure, even when the world tried to drown it out. At home, I lit a single candle and sat at my small kitchen table. I pulled out my notebook, the pages worn and familiar, and began to write. Not for anyone else, just for me. The words flowed steady and true, each one a step forward, each one a promise to the girl I'd been and the woman I was becoming. I will not be silenced. I will not let their noise define me. I will stand in my quiet strength, and I will not be moved. When I finished, I closed the notebook and let the quiet settle around me. Outside, the city hummed and whispered a lullaby of distant voices and soft night sounds, and in the quiet I found myself, whole, unbroken, strong. Spring deepened, bringing soft rains that made the city smell of earth and possibility. Each morning, I woke to the steady patter of water on the windowpane and felt something inside me settle like the last pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. At work, things began to shift in ways I could feel, even if I couldn't always see them. People noticed my quiet more than they ever had before, but it wasn't the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. It was the quiet of someone who didn't need to say everything. She still hovered still, tried to push me with her words and her bright, brittle smiles. But I'd learned how to let those things pass over me like wind. I saw them for what they were, noise. And noise couldn't break me. One morning, she stopped by my desk with a stack of papers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I need you to look these over," she said, her voice warm and sharp all at once. I met her gaze steadily. "Of course," I said. My tone was calm even. She searched my face for something, fear maybe, or hesitation, but found only stillness. She didn't understand that in my silence I'd found a kind of freedom. I didn't owe her anything. Not my fear, not my voice. And that was something she could never take. At home, I let the quiet wrap around me like a safe harbor. I took long walks in the rain, the drops soft and cold on my skin, washing away the weight of the day. In the quiet of those walks, I felt my strength like a steady drumbeat in my chest. I began to realize that silence wasn't just about holding back, it was about choosing when to let the words go. And when I chose to speak, it would be because I wanted to, not because she demanded it. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in a small cafe near the office, a place with chipped mugs and worn wooden chairs that felt like an embrace. I sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and let the gentle murmur of conversations wash over me. I took out my notebook and began to write. The words came easily now, no longer stuck behind a wall of fear. I wrote about the girl I'd been, about the nights I'd spent staring at the ceiling, the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on me like a stone. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, someone who understood that her voice didn't have to be loud to be powerful, someone who had learned to trust the steady beat of her own heart. As I wrote, I felt a quiet pride settle in my bones. Because for the first time, I wasn't writing for anyone else's approval. I was writing for me. Later that week, she called a team meeting. The air in the conference room was thick with anticipation, the low hum of whispered conversations filling the space. She sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her smile bright. She spoke in her usual way, confident, charming, weaving her words like a net. I listened carefully, letting the words wash over me, but I didn't let them pull me under. When she tried to turn the conversation to me, I met her gaze calmly, my silence measured and deliberate. "Do you have anything to add?" she asked, her voice light, but there was a challenge in her eyes. I held her gaze for a long moment before shaking my head. "Not today," I said softly. And in that simple answer, I saw the flicker of something in her expression, something like doubt. Because she couldn't twist what I didn't say. She couldn't use my silence against me when it was mine to hold. After the meeting, I lingered in the empty room, letting the quiet settle over me like a balm. I could still feel the echoes of her voice, the way she tried to fill every space with her presence. But in the quiet that followed, I felt something else too, the weight of my own choice, solid and sure. I knew she would never understand it. She'd built her power on noise, on filling the air with her laughter and her cutting words. But I'd learned that real power doesn't come from how loud you are. It comes from how steady you can be when everything around you tries to shake you. That night, I walked home through the drizzle, the city lights turning the wet pavement to rivers of gold. My reflection shimmered in the puddles, solid, real, and unbroken. At home, I lit a candle and let the soft glow fill the room. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, the pen, warm and familiar in my hand. I wrote about the small victories, every moment I'd chosen to stand my ground, every time I'd let my silence speak louder than her words. I wrote about the way my breath felt in my chest, steady and sure, and how I was learning to trust it more every day. I will not let her noise drown out my quiet. I will not let her words become my story. My silence is not emptiness. It is strength. It is mine. When I finished, I closed the notebook and let the quiet settle around me like a promise. Outside, the rain fell soft and steady, and in its rhythm, I felt the echo of my own heartbeat. I knew there would be more battles. She wasn't done, and neither was I. But in the hush of that night, I understood something that I hadn't before. She thought I'd never speak, but she was wrong. Because in the quiet, I had found my voice. And when I was ready to use it, it would be unstoppable. The days grew warmer, the city waking up in a riot of color. Flowers spilled over garden fences, and the air buzzed with the promise of change. But inside me, the quiet held fast, stronger than ever. She tried harder now. Her laughter was louder, her jokes sharper, as if the force of her voice could drown out the steady hush I carried with me. She watched me in meetings, her eyes bright with challenge, waiting for me to stumble. But I didn't. I met her gaze with a calm she couldn't shatter. One morning, she found me alone in the break room, my fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She moved in close, her voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "Funny, isn't it?" she said, her lips curling in that perfect smile. "How you're always so silent. People might think you don't have anything worth saying." I held her gaze, my silence measured and deliberate. Then I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the quiet stretch between us like a challenge. I didn't need to defend myself. My silence said everything she didn't want to hear. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, something like doubt. She stepped back, her smile slipping just a fraction, and walked away without another word. That was the first crack. It was small, but I saw it, and I knew her power depended on the noise she made, the way she could twist every word into a blade. But my power didn't depend on her at all. It was mine, built in the spaces she couldn't touch. At home, I let that knowledge settle into my bones. I spent my evenings in the gentle hush of my apartment, the soft flicker of candlelight on the walls. I wrote in my notebook, the pen scratching across the page like a heartbeat. "Silence is not emptiness," I wrote. "It is the place where I find my strength, the place where her voice can't reach me." The next day at work, she called another meeting. The room was bright and humming with energy, but I felt calm centered in a way I hadn't before. She spoke with her usual poise, her words smooth and polished, but there was an edge there, now a sharpness that hadn't been there before. When she turned to me, her voice light and falsely sweet, I didn't look away. "Do you have anything to add?" she asked, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I met her gaze, my breath steady. "No," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Not right now." And in that simple answer, I felt the room shift around us. She didn't smile this time. She blinked her fingers, drumming a silent beat on the table. The others exchanged glances, and I saw it in their eyes, a flicker of something new. Respect, curiosity, the beginning of understanding. Because they saw what she couldn't, my silence wasn't a void. It was a choice, a promise, a quiet defiance she couldn't break. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway. Her eyes were bright, her smile brittle. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said softly. I tilted my head, the calm inside me, like a steady flame. "Only if you think it's a game," I said. And I watched her blink her breath, catching just for a second. That was the second crack. At home that night, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker in the darkness. I thought about how far I'd come, about the girl. I'd been the one who had learned to survive by being small, by swallowing her words. I thought about the woman I was becoming, and how the quiet had never been about weakness. It had always been about strength. I wrote late into the night, the pen flying across the page. I wrote about every time she'd tried to push me down, every moment I'd held my ground. I wrote about the way silence could be a sanctuary and a weapon, both at once. She thinks I'm afraid, I wrote. But I'm not. I'm just waiting for the moment when I'm ready to speak. And when I do, it will be the end of her noise. The next morning, I woke to the soft glow of dawn and felt a sense of peace I couldn't name. At work, she avoided my eyes for the first time, her voice a little too bright, her laughter a little too loud. I watched her carefully, the way her smile wavered when she thought no one was watching, and I knew she could feel it too. The power she'd held for so long, slipping piece by piece into the quiet. Because silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the presence of everything you refuse to let them take from you. And I was done giving her anything at all. The first hints of summer began to stretch across the city, warm breezes slipping through the open windows of my apartment. The world seemed softer, brighter, but inside the office, the air felt tighter than ever, like a rubber band stretched to the edge of snapping. She'd grown more restless. Her laughter was louder, her smiles sharper, and her eyes never stopped searching for a crack in my calm. Each day, I watched her dance around me with the same brittle charm, and each day I met her with the same measured silence. It was driving her crazy. One afternoon, she called me into her office. The blinds were half closed, the light slanting across her desk in harsh stripes. She sat with perfect posture, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the polished wood. "I'm concerned," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "about your attitude, about how detached you seem lately." I kept my expression calm, my eyes steady. "I'm here to work," I said. "I'm focused on that." She smiled a tight, humorless smile. "Of course, but some people find your reserve unsettling. It's not team-friendly." Her words slipped around me like water finding no purchase. "I'm doing my job," I said simply. "Yes," she said, "but it's not enough to just do your job. People expect more than that. They expect engagement, conversation, warmth." She was trying to rattle me, to pull me into her game. I could feel the weight of her words pressing against me, like a hand on my throat, but I didn't flinch. "I've never promised to be what you expect," I said softly. And there it was, the third crack. A flicker in her eyes, a pause in her perfect rhythm. She didn't know what to do with my quiet anymore. It was no longer something she could use. It was a mirror she couldn't bear to look into. She dismissed me with a wave of her hand, but I walked out of that office taller, my shoulders back, and my head high. Because I realized something important in that moment, my silence had stopped being a defense. It had become an offense, a presence she couldn't diminish no matter how hard she tried. At home, I felt the shift deep in my bones. I moved through the rooms of my small apartment with a new kind of certainty, each step a quiet defiance. I didn't need anyone's permission to be here. I didn't need anyone's voice to validate mine. In the evenings, I wrote in my notebook until the words blurred on the page. I wrote about the girl I'd been and the woman I was becoming. I wrote about how silence could be both shield and blade, both balm and boundary. She thinks my quiet is a weakness, I wrote, but it's a choice, and in that choice, I am stronger than she will ever understand. One morning, I woke to the city bathed in gold, the early light making the cracked sidewalk outside my window look like veins of light. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel strong, crisp lines, soft colors, a small but certain shield of self-respect. At the office, she tried again. She cornered me by the elevators, her voice low and urgent. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You think this silence makes you powerful, but it just makes you invisible." I met her eyes calmly. "Maybe you're just not seeing clearly," I said. For a moment she stared at me, her breath caught in her throat. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps sharp and quick. And I felt something settle in my chest, a deep, quiet satisfaction. Because for the first time, I realized she was afraid of me. Not because of anything I said, but because of everything I refused to give her. That night, I stood by my window and watched the city breathe around me. The soft glow of streetlights, the hush of distant traffic, the world turning slow and steady. In that quiet, I felt the beat of my own heart, calm, sure, unbreakable. I whispered to the night, to the girl I used to be, to the woman I was still becoming. "You don't get to tell me who I am. You don't get to decide what my silence means." And in that promise, I found a peace deeper than any noise she could make, a power stronger than any word she could throw. Because she thought I'd never speak, but she didn't understand I'd already said everything I needed to, and my silence was no longer her weapon, it was mine. The summer heat settled over the city like a heavy blanket, but inside me, the air felt crisp and clear. Each day, I woke with a quiet certainty in my chest, a strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. At the office, the tension hummed like a live wire. She moved through the halls with the same bright smile, but there was a strain in her eyes now, a flicker of something she couldn't hide. She could feel it too, the way the balance had shifted, the way the silence she'd once used against me had become my shield and my weapon. She tried to claw it back, to fill every room with her laughter and her cutting words. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fill the spaces I refused to give her. She couldn't touch the quiet I carried inside me. One afternoon, she called me into her office again. The air was stifling, the sun slanting through the blinds in sharp stripes. She sat with her shoulders straight and her hands folded neatly on the desk, her expression smooth as glass. "You know," she said, her voice calm, "people are starting to talk. They say you're cold, that you're making things difficult for everyone." I met her eyes steady and unflinching. "I'm not here to please everyone," I said softly. "I'm here to work, and I'm doing that." For a moment, she just looked at me, her eyes flickering like a candle in the dark. Then she leaned back in her chair, her smile slipping. "You think this silence makes you strong?" she said, almost a whisper. "But you're just hiding." I shook my head, the calm in me, like a steady drumbeat. "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm choosing. And that choice isn't about you." She blinked just once. A crack in the mask. And in that moment, I saw the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty she'd tried to bury beneath her bright smile. Because she realized what I had known all along, my silence wasn't something she could control. It wasn't something she could twist into weakness. It was mine, and it was unbreakable. When I left her office, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd carried for years had finally slipped from my shoulders. The hallway was cool and quiet, the hum of the building, a soft, steady rhythm. I walked back to my desk, with my head high, the calm in me deeper than the summer sky. That night, I sat by the open window in my apartment, the warm breeze stirring the curtains. The city was alive outside, but inside I felt a peace I'd never known before. I wrote in my notebook, the words flowing like water. She doesn't understand, I wrote. She thinks silence is an empty space. But it's not. It's a place where I can hear my own heart, where I can find my own strength. I thought about how far I'd come, about the girl who'd once been afraid to take up space, who'd learned to survive by being small. I thought about the woman I was now, and how the quiet that had once felt like a prison had become my freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned sweet with the scent of jasmine, I ran into her outside the office. She was alone for once, her bright smile nowhere to be seen. For a moment, she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "You've changed," she said quietly. I met her gaze, my voice soft but certain. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting you tell me who I was." She didn't say anything else. She just looked at me, her mouth opening as if to speak, and then closing again. And in that silence, I felt something shift, like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. At home, I sat in the golden light of evening and let the quiet wash over me. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her words. All I needed was the calm in my own breath, the steady beat of my own heart. Because she thought I'd never speak. But she didn't understand I didn't need to speak to be heard. My silence had always been my power, and now it was my voice. The days grew longer and hotter, the city shimmering in the summer sun. But inside me, there was a coolness, a steady, quiet calm that felt like a secret I carried in my chest. At the office, she tried to pretend nothing had changed. She still moved through the rooms with that easy smile, still filled the air with her bright laughter. But the people around her had begun to notice. They watched the spaces between her words now, the way her voice would falter for just a breath when I held her gaze. And me, I didn't flinch. I didn't try to fill the silence she hated so much. I let it stretch between us like a bridge I'd built for myself. Each moment of quiet was a choice, and each choice was a promise: I will not let you break me. One morning, she stopped by my desk, her fingers drumming a restless beat on the edge. "You know," she said, her voice soft and deliberate, "you'd go further if you'd just speak up more. People like confidence." I looked up at her, calm and steady. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," I said. My voice was quiet, but the words landed like stones. She blinked her hand, stilling for just a moment. Then she smiled, too wide, too bright. "Of course," she said. But her eyes didn't match her smile. I watched her walk away, her shoulders a little tighter, her steps a little too fast, and I felt the truth settle in my bones. She wasn't afraid of my voice. She was afraid of the strength I carried in my quiet. At home, I let the stillness wrap around me like a warm blanket. I spent my evenings with my notebook, open the pages, filling with thoughts and dreams I hadn't dared to speak out loud. The words felt safe there, honest and real, in a way they never were under her gaze. I wrote about the girl I used to be, the one who thought silence was something to be ashamed of. The one who thought her worth was measured by how loud she could laugh, how easily she could bend to fit someone else's expectations. And then I wrote about the woman I was now. The one who had learned that silence can be a choice, that stillness can be power. The one who didn't need to be loud to be strong. "She can't take this from me," I wrote, because it was never hers to take. My voice, my quiet, my choice, it's all mine. One night, I ran into her outside the office. The air was warm and heavy, the streetlights painting everything in golden shadow. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching. "You're different now," she said softly, almost like she was speaking to herself. I nodded. "I am." She looked away, her shoulders slumping just a little. For the first time, she didn't have anything to say. She didn't have a smile to hide behind, didn't have a cutting remark to fill the space between us. And in that quiet, I felt something like forgiveness settle in my chest. Not for her, but for myself. For the girl who had once thought she had to be small to be safe. I turned and walked away, my steps steady on the warm pavement. Each breath felt like freedom, each beat of my heart, a promise to the woman I was becoming. At home, I lit a candle and watched the flame flicker in the dark. I thought about how far I'd come, about the strength I'd found in the spaces she couldn't touch. Because she thought I'd never speak. But she didn't understand. I didn't need to speak to be strong. I didn't need to shout to be heard. My silence was never emptiness. It was everything I'd built for myself. And it was enough. The summer nights grew longer, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers and warm rain. I found solace in the small rituals of my days, the morning coffee steaming in my hands, the soft glow of streetlights on my evening walks, the quiet weight of the world when the office was empty and still. At work, the tension that had once felt like a chain around my neck had begun to fade. People no longer looked at me like I was something to be fixed or explained. They saw me calm, capable, unbreakable. They saw the strength I carried in my silence. But she hadn't let go. I could feel it in the way she watched me, her bright laughter a little too sharp, her words a little too careful. She'd spent so long trying to keep me small that she didn't know how to let me be anything else. One morning, she stopped me in the hallway. The light was soft, slanting through the high windows, and painting her face in gold and shadow. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've changed," she said quietly. I met her gaze steady and calm. "I've grown," I said. She tilted her head, her smile fading. "Is that what you call it, growing?" "It's what it feels like," I said. My voice was gentle, but it held a weight that filled the space between us. For a moment, she looked at me like she wanted to say more. But then she turned away, her shoulders stiff, her steps quick and sure. And I realized she didn't know how to stand in the quiet I carried. She didn't know how to meet me in the stillness she'd once used to try to break me. That was her burden to carry, not mine. At home, I found peace in the soft glow of candlelight and the quiet rustle of pages turning beneath my fingers. I wrote late into the night, my pen moving like a heartbeat across the page. I wrote about the girl I used to be, the girl who thought silence was a prison, the girl who thought she had to fill every space with noise just to be seen. And I wrote about the woman I was now, the one who knew that silence can be a sanctuary, the one who had learned to stand in her own strength, even when the world tried to tell her she had none. She thought she could use my quiet against me, I wrote. But she didn't understand that in the quiet I found myself. And in finding myself, I found everything she could never take. The next day at the office, she tried one last time. A meeting. A room full of people, her voice weaving its usual bright net of words. But I felt the shift before she even spoke. The way the others looked at me now, like they saw more than just the quiet girl in the corner. Like they saw the woman who didn't need to shout to be heard. When she turned to me, her question hanging in the air, I paused for just a breath. Then I met her eyes and said, calm and certain, I have nothing to add. And that was enough. Because my silence wasn't emptiness, it was choice, it was power. And in that moment, I realized that the only voice I ever needed to hear was my own. That night, I walked home through the warm air, the city alive around me. I felt the weight of everything I'd carried for so long slipping from my shoulders, like a worn-out coat. And I felt lighter, freer, stronger. She thought I'd never speak, but she didn't understand I didn't need to speak to be whole. I didn't need to be loud to be heard. In the quiet, I had found everything I'd ever needed. And in the quiet, I was finally free. The day had come, the one I had quietly prepared for without a sound, the day when silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. It wasn't a loud declaration or a shouted confrontation. No, it was something deeper, more enduring. I walked into the room where it all began, the place where her words had once cut through me like knives, where the weight of judgment had felt unbearable. The room was filled with familiar faces, the same people who had watched in silence as she spoke over me, dismissed me, tried to erase me. But today the air was different. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, and my heart steady. I didn't need to speak. I didn't have to defend myself or shout over the noise. My presence was enough. Her eyes found mine sharp and searching, but I was no longer the girl who shrank away. I was a woman who had found her power in the spaces between words, a woman who had learned that silence could speak louder than any scream. She opened her mouth as if to challenge me to claim control like she always had. But I didn't flinch. I held her gaze steady and calm, and then, without a word, I turned and walked away. The room fell into a hush, not of shock, but of respect. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Because sometimes silence is the loudest voice of all. In the days that followed, I felt the shift ripple through the world around me. People who had once doubted me now looked at me with new eyes, eyes that saw strength, resilience, and quiet determination. They no longer tried to fill the spaces I left empty. They understood that my silence was not absence, but presence. At home, in the quiet sanctuary I had built with my own hands, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. I lit candles, poured a glass of wine, and sat down with my notebook, the place where my true voice had always lived. I wrote about everything, the pain of being unheard, the fear of standing alone, the slow, steady climb toward reclaiming myself. I wrote about the power of choosing when and how to speak, about the strength found in stillness, and about the peace that comes when you stop trying to prove yourself to those who refuse to see. My silence was never about submission, I wrote. It was a promise to myself, to my future, to the woman I was becoming. A promise that no matter what they said or did, I would never let their noise define me. That night, I looked out at the stars and whispered a quiet thank you to the silence that had carried me to the strength I'd found within, and to the journey that had made me whole. Because in the end, she thought I'd never speak. But I had spoken all along. Not with words, but with every step I took, every boundary I set, every quiet moment of courage. And my silence, it was my power.